The winter wind cut through the mountain valleys of Wyoming Territory like a knife, but Zara Sumner barely noticed it anymore. Her weathered hands clutched a worn rifle as she tracked deer prints through the fresh snow, the only sound her own steady breathing in the December dawn of 1876. 5 years alone in these mountains had taught her how to survive when the world below thought her long dead, and that was exactly how she preferred it. The crack of a branch somewhere behind her made Zara freeze. Not an animal, too deliberate, too heavy. She melted into the shadows of a pine grove, her buckskin clothing blending with the forest. Through the trees, she spotted him, a man on horseback, moving slowly through her territory. The third stranger in as many months to venture this far up the mountain. The others had eventually left. This one would too, one way or another. Yancey Quinn dismounted his chestnut gelding with a wince, rubbing his lower back where the trail had punished him for the last several hours. The old-timer in Taylorsville had laughed when he mentioned searching the western ridge. "Ain't nothing up there but bears and ghost stories," the man had said, nursing his whiskey. "Though some trappers swear they've seen smoke from a cabin high up, call her the mountain witch." The tavern had erupted in laughter. "Best leave her be, young fella. Mountains don't take kindly to outsiders." Yancey had simply nodded and ordered another drink. He wasn't here for ghosts or witches. He was here because the railroad would soon cut through this pass, and his employers expected a thorough survey. If someone was living on the planned route, he needed to know. He tethered his horse to a sturdy pine and stretched. That's when he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. His hand instinctively moved toward the colt at his hip. "I wouldn't," came a woman's voice, clear and sharp as the mountain air. Yancey froze, slowly raising his hands. "I mean no harm." "Then state your business and leave," the voice replied. "This is private land." "According to the territorial records, madam, this land belongs to the federal government." A bitter laugh echoed through the trees. "Government. Another word for men who take what isn't theirs." Yancey turned slowly toward the voice, finally spotting her, a woman with a rifle trained steadily at his chest. Her dark hair was braided back from a face weathered by sun and wind, yet still youthful. She couldn't be much older than 25, though her eyes held the wariness of someone far older. "My name is Yancey Quinn. I'm a surveyor for the Western Pacific Railroad." Something flashed across her face, fear. Anger. It was gone before he could identify it. Railroad. She spat the word like poison. "Then we have nothing to discuss. Get back on your horse and ride away." A gust of wind cut through the clearing, and Yancey noticed her slight shiver despite her layers of animal hides and wool. Winter was settling in hard, and though she clearly knew these mountains, surviving alone would be brutal in the months ahead. "I'll leave," he said carefully, "but I'll be back tomorrow. My job requires me to map this entire region." "Your job," she said coldly, "means nothing to me." As the light began to fade, fat snowflakes started falling. Yancey looked at the darkening sky with concern. "Madam, there's a storm coming. I should make camp not here. This mountain isn't yours to claim." "I'm not claiming anything. But I won't survive trying to navigate down in the dark during a snowstorm." He gestured toward the ominous clouds rolling in. "I'll freeze to death." For the first time, uncertainty crossed her features. She lowered her rifle slightly, though it remained pointed in his general direction. "There's a cave half a mile east. You'll find shelter there." Yancey nodded his thanks, but as he gathered his horse's reins, the animal spooked suddenly. A mountain lion's scream pierced the twilight frighteningly close. The horse reared, pulling free and bolting through the trees before Yancey could grab hold. "Damn it!" He started after the horse, but the woman's voice stopped him. "He's headed for a steep ravine. You'll never catch him before dark." Yancey stared into the growing gloom where his horse had disappeared, along with his supplies, maps, and equipment. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes reducing visibility to mere yards. The woman studied him, conflict evident on her face. Finally, she lowered her rifle completely. "The cave I mentioned isn't stocked," she said reluctantly. "You'd likely freeze anyway." She seemed to wrestle with herself before adding, "My cabin is nearby. You can shelter there tonight, just tonight. Then you take what's left of your survey and go back to your railroad men." Yancey knew better than to show his relief too plainly. "Thank you, Miss Zara," she said after a lengthy pause. "Just Zara." "Thank you, Zara. Don't thank me yet," she warned. "And if you try anything at all, I'll put a bullet in you without hesitation." "Understood," Yancey replied simply. She kept him walking ahead of her, the rifle still in hand as they trudged through deepening snow. The wind picked up, driving ice crystals into their faces as they climbed a narrow path winding between boulders and pines. After 20 minutes of brutal hiking, they reached a small cabin nestled against a cliff face, nearly invisible among the trees. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and the warm glow of firelight leaked through shuttered windows. It was sturdy but humble, a single room built of massive logs with a small covered porch. "Inside," Zara directed, following close behind. The cabin's interior was surprisingly well appointed. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking area nearby. Furs and hand-woven blankets covered a bed built into the corner. Shelves lined with preserved foods, herbs, and supplies spoke of careful preparation. Hanging from the rafters were bundles of dried plants, cured meats, and animal pelts. "You've built quite a home," Yancey said, genuinely impressed. Zara bolted the door against the howling wind. "Remove your coat and boots. Place your weapons on the table. All of them." He complied, setting his Colt revolver on the rough-hewn table, followed by a hunting knife from his belt. After a moment's hesitation, he added a small derringer from his boot. Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Thorough man. Cautious," he corrected, "like you." The comparison didn't appear to please her. She hung his snow-covered coat near the fire and gestured to a chair. "Sit. Don't touch anything." The storm's fury increased outside, wind battering the shutters as Zara moved efficiently around the cabin. She added logs to the fire, hung a pot of something that smelled like rabbit stew over the flames, and checked that the windows were secure. "Been up here long?" Yancey asked, trying to break the tense silence. Zara paused in her work, evaluating whether to answer. 5 years, she finally said, alone. The look she gave him could have frozen the fire. "Yes. That's a long time to be without company. Company is overrated." She stirred the pot with more force than necessary. "Most people talk without saying anything worth hearing." Yancey nodded, watching as she worked. Her movements were efficient, practiced. This wasn't some temporary hideout, this was a life she'd built deliberately. "The railroad will be coming through this pass by next autumn," he said carefully. "The government has already approved the route." Her back stiffened. "Your railroad can find another way." "It's not my railroad, Miss Zara. I'm just the surveyor." "Just following orders," she said bitterly. A common excuse for unconscionable acts. Yancey fell silent, watching as she ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls. She placed one before him along with a spoon carved from bone. "Eat," she said. "Then sleep by the fire. At first light I'll help you find your horse and you'll leave." The stew was surprisingly good, rich with wild herbs and tender meat. They ate in silence, the only sounds the howling wind and crackling fire. When finished, Zara took the bowls to a basin and cleaned them with melted snow water. "Why here?" Yancey asked suddenly. "Of all places to make a home alone." She didn't answer immediately, arranging furs and blankets near the fire for him. "Because up here," she finally said, "the only rules are nature's, and nature doesn't lie or betray." She gestured to his makeshift bed. "Rest while you can. Dawn comes early." Yancey settled onto the pallet of furs, watching as Zara checked her rifle one last time before retreating to her bed in the corner. Despite the warmth of the cabin, he sensed the cold wall she'd built around herself. Whatever had driven her to this solitary existence had cut deep. In the night, he woke to her whimpering in her sleep, words he couldn't make out except for repeated pleas of no and please. He considered waking her from what was clearly a nightmare but thought better of it. This woman who lived with a rifle at her side wouldn't welcome such an intrusion. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of snow covering the mountain. Zara was already awake, brewing something that smelled like pine needle tea. "Your horse left clear tracks," she said without preamble. "If we hurry, we can find him before the sun melts the snow." They set out after a simple breakfast of dried meat and hard biscuits. Zara moved through the forest like a ghost, reading signs invisible to his eyes. She wore snowshoes fashioned from bent wood and rawhide, while Yancey struggled through drifts that sometimes reached his knees. "There," she pointed, after they'd hiked nearly 2 miles. "Your horse found shelter in that stand of pines." Sure enough, Yancey's gelding was grazing on exposed grass beneath the protective branches of massive pine trees. The animal seemed unharmed but skittish. "Easy, Magnus," Yancey soothed as he approached. "Easy, boy." The horse allowed him to take hold of the reins this time. Yancey checked his saddlebags with relief. His surveying equipment and maps were still intact, though his bedroll had been torn loose during the animal's flight. "Appears you have what you came for," Zara said, her voice returning to its earlier coldness. "Taylorsville is that way." She pointed south. "Follow the ridgeline until you reach the river, then west." Yancey secured his equipment but didn't immediately mount. "I still have work to do in these mountains." "Not on my section," she said firmly. "The railroad is coming, Miss Zara. If not through me, then through someone else. They'll bring men with badges and papers, men with guns." Something like panic flashed in her eyes before she masked it. "Then I'll move deeper into the wilderness." "There's less and less wilderness every year." "That's not my concern." Yancey sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "At least let me compensate you for the shelter and food." She looked insulted. "I don't want your money." "Then information," he countered. "Let me tell you exactly where the route is planned. That way you can prepare." This gave her pause. Finally, she nodded curtly. "Just the route, nothing else." "I'll need my maps." Suspicion immediately returned to her face. "Then get them and be quick about it." Yancey retrieved a rolled parchment from his saddlebags and spread it against a flat boulder. Zara approached cautiously, maintaining distance until curiosity drew her closer. The map showed the mountains in remarkable detail, with a red line cutting through the heart of her territory. "The track will come through here." He traced the line with his finger, following the natural pass, then cutting across this plateau before descending toward Taylorsville. Zara's face paled as she studied the map. "That's—" her voice faltered. "That's directly through my cabin. I'm afraid so." She backed away from the map as if it had burned her. "Leave," she said, her voice tight. "You've delivered your message, now go." "Zara, there might be ways to go," she shouted, her composure cracking. "Go back to your world and leave me to what little time I have left in mine." Yancey rolled the map carefully, returning it to his saddlebag. "I'll be in Taylorsville for another 2 weeks," he said quietly. "At the Walker Inn if you want to discuss options." Her only response was to turn away, walking back toward her cabin without a backward glance. Yancey mounted his horse with a heavy sigh. knowing he'd just delivered what amounted to an eviction notice to a woman who had clearly fled civilization for deeply personal reasons. As he guided Magnus down the mountain, he couldn't shake the image of Zara's face when she realized her sanctuary was marked for destruction. Nor could he forget the peaceful isolation of her cabin, the ingenuity of her self-sufficient existence. It seemed wrong to destroy something built with such care and determination. For the first time in his career as a surveyor, Yancey Quinn questioned whether progress always pointed in the right direction. 3 days later, Yancey sat in the Walker Inn, reviewing his notes and maps by lamplight. The common room hummed with the usual evening crowd: ranch hands, miners, and a few travelers passing through Taylorsville on their way to larger settlements. He'd spent the days since his return conducting additional surveys of the lower elevations, but his thoughts kept returning to the solitary woman on the mountain. "Another coffee, Mr. Quinn?" asked Eliza, the innkeeper's daughter. "Thank you, yes," he replied with a tired smile. As she poured, she glanced at his maps. "You're still working on that railroad survey, final details. The engineers in Chicago need precise measurements before construction begins in spring." Eliza's eyes brightened. "Pa says the railroad will make Taylorsville boom. Says we might even get a proper school and church built." "That's likely true," Yancey agreed. The transformation of small outposts into thriving towns followed the railroad like flowers after spring rain. It was one of the aspects of his work that usually gave him satisfaction. The inn's door opened, bringing a blast of cold air. Conversations momentarily paused as patrons turned to see who had entered. Yancey's coffee cup halted halfway to his lips. Zara stood in the doorway, nearly unrecognizable. Gone were the buckskins and furs, replaced by a simple dark dress that looked ill-fitting and uncomfortable. Her hair was pulled back severely, and she clutched a worn shawl around her shoulders. But her eyes remained the same, wary, observant, ready for danger. Those eyes found him immediately. The room resumed its chatter as she made her way toward his table, ignoring the curious stares of the townspeople. "Miss Sumner," Eliza exclaimed with genuine surprise. "We haven't seen you in town for, must be years now." Zara gave a tight nod but offered no explanation for her appearance. "Would you like some coffee?" Eliza offered. "Or perhaps something stronger, just privacy," Zara replied quietly. Eliza glanced between them with obvious curiosity before retreating. Zara took the chair across from Yancey, her posture rigid, hands folded tightly in her lap. "I didn't expect to see you," Yancey said honestly. "Nor I you again," she replied. "But necessity makes for strange choices." Yancey pushed aside his maps. "What can I do for you, Miss Sumner?" Her jaw tightened at the use of her surname. "You know my name." "You know mine, and apparently more about me than I realized, given that Eliza recognized you. Small towns have long memories." She lowered her voice. "Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" Yancey considered this. "My room upstairs would be inappropriate for a lady." A sharp laugh escaped her. "I haven't been considered a lady in this town for a very long time, Mr. Quinn, but if propriety concerns you, we can walk." The night air was crisp, but not unbearable as they strolled away from the inn. Oil lamps illuminated Taylorsville's Main Street, casting long shadows as they passed the general store, post office, and sheriff's building. Zara kept her head down, avoiding the gaze of the few townspeople still about. "You said you had options," she finally spoke when they reached the edge of town. "About the cabin?" Yancey nodded. "Several possibilities, though none perfect. First, compensation. The railroad company is required to pay fair market value for any structures or improvements on the land they claim. Money." She dismissed this with a gesture. "What would I do with it? Buy another piece of wilderness that will eventually be taken too. You could purchase land with proper title, he suggested. Something secure. There's no security in paper promises. They walked in silence for several paces before he offered. Second option, relocation. The railroad sometimes moves structures rather than demolishing them if the owner has claim to nearby land. I have no legal claim to any land, she admitted. I simply inhabit. Yancey had suspected as much. Third option would be to petition for a route adjustment. It's rare, but sometimes the company will make minor alterations to avoid excessive costs or engineering challenges. This caught her attention. Is that possible? Honestly, it would be difficult. The pass through your section is the most direct and level approach. Any deviation means more blasting, more bridges, more expense. He saw her hope faltering and added, but not impossible. I could make the case that the terrain half a mile north presents equal advantages. Would that lie convince them? It wouldn't be entirely a lie, just an emphasis on certain facts over others. They had reached a small bridge over the creek that ran along the town's border. Zara leaned against the railing, staring into the dark water below. "Why would you do that for me?" she asked, suspicion evident in her tone. "What do you gain?" The question caught him off guard. "Not everything is a transaction, Miss Sumner. In my experience, Mr. Quinn, everything is." She turned to face him fully. "Men don't offer help without expecting something in return." The bitterness in her voice spoke volumes about whatever had driven her to isolation. Yancey chose his next words carefully. "I believe in progress, but not at any cost. The railroad will bring many good things to this territory, but that doesn't mean every consequence is justified." "Pretty words," she said, but with less hostility. "I can make no guarantees," he continued, "but I'm willing to try if you'll tell me why that cabin matters so much. Help me understand what I'm fighting for." Zara was quiet for so long that Yancey thought she might simply walk away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "5 years ago, I fled this town with nothing but my father's rifle and the clothes on my back. My husband had died 2 months earlier. Pneumonia took him after a mining accident left him bedridden. We had no children, no family nearby. Just debts." She took a shaky breath. "The banker, Mr. Hargrove, offered to forgive the mortgage if I would, accommodate his needs. When I refused, he claimed my husband had taken additional loans I knew nothing about. Said the house, the land, everything would be seized unless I reconsidered his generous offer." Anger flashed in her eyes at the memory. "I still refused. That night, Hargrove and the sheriff appeared at my door with papers I couldn't read and men to remove me. When I resisted, the sheriff struck me, called me hysterical. They dragged me out as Hargrove's men emptied the house of everything Thomas and I had built together." Yancey's jaw tightened at the injustice, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I spent that night in the sheriff's cell for creating a disturbance. In the morning, Hargrove came again with his proposition. I spat in his face." A grim smile touched her lips. "When they opened the cell to teach me manners, I ran into the mountains where my father had taught me to hunt as a girl, and built a new life," Yancey said softly. She nodded. "At first, I just wanted to survive the week, then the month, then winter. Each season I grew stronger, more self-reliant. The cabin started as a simple shelter, but year by year, I improved it. It's mine in a way nothing in this world has ever truly been mine." The pieces fell into place for Yancey, her distrust of authority, her fierce independence, her determination to protect the home she'd created. "Hargrove still runs the bank," she added, gesturing toward a large house on the hill overlooking the town. "The sheriff is his brother-in-law. If I tried to establish myself legally anywhere near Taylorsville, they would find reasons to drive me out again. And farther from here. This is the only home I've known, she said simply. My parents are buried south of town, Thomas too, and the mountains. She looked toward the dark silhouette of the peaks against the night sky. They saved me when nothing else would. Yancey understood then what he was asking her to give up, not just a structure of logs and stone, but her hard-won freedom, her healing, her sanctuary from the injustices of men. I'll do what I can, he promised. The company sends an engineering team to review my findings next week. I'll argue for the northern route. For the first time, something like hope flickered in her eyes. Why? You don't know me. Perhaps I'd like to, he said before he could stop himself. The words hung between them in the cold night air. Zara studied his face, searching for deception or ulterior motives. You would risk your position for a stranger. For what's right, he corrected, then added more softly, and you're not entirely a stranger anymore. She looked away first, uncomfortable with the sentiment. I should return to my mountain before dawn. I'll await your word on the route. How will I contact you? After a moment's consideration, she said. There's a hunter's blind near the large waterfall about 2 miles below my cabin. Leave a message there when you have news. Yancey nodded. Be careful returning. The moon is waning. I see better in darkness than most in daylight, she replied, pulling her shawl tighter. With a final nod, she turned and walked away, quickly disappearing into the shadows beyond the town's lamplight. As Yancey watched her go, he realized he'd just committed to challenging his employers on behalf of a woman who barely trusted him. A woman whose fierce independence both intrigued and concerned him. If the company rejected his proposal, she would lose everything again. If they accepted it, she would retreat back to her solitude, and he would likely never see her again. Neither outcome sat well with him as he made his way back to the inn. The engineering team arrived from Chicago exactly 1 week later, 4 stern-faced men in city clothes, who looked distinctly uncomfortable in Taylorsville's rugged surroundings. Yancey spent 3 days guiding them through the lower sections of the route, carefully building his case before broaching the subject of the mountain pass. These survey notes indicate a viable alternative through this northern section, he explained, pointing to the map spread across the table in the private dining room of the Walker Inn. The grade is comparable, and while it would require an additional quarter-mile of track, it avoids several unstable rock formations that could pose long-term maintenance issues. Frederick Ashton, the lead engineer, studied the maps with a skeptical expression. Your initial report recommended the southern pass as optimal. What changed your assessment, Quinn? Yancey had prepared for this question. Further geological examination. The recent heavy snows revealed evidence of rock slides along the southern ridge that weren't apparent during dry conditions. Slides are manageable with proper reinforcement, countered Ashton. At considerable expense, Yancey argued. The northern route would ultimately prove more economical over time. Ashton exchanged glances with his colleagues. We'll need to verify these findings ourselves before making any route adjustments. Of course, Yancey agreed. I've scheduled an expedition to both sites tomorrow. As the meeting concluded, Ashton held Yancey back with a hand on his arm. Quinn, the company values your expertise, but sudden changes to established plans raise questions. I hope your recommendation is based solely on engineering considerations. The implication was clear. Yancey met the man's gaze steadily. My only concern is the long-term success of the railroad, sir. Whether Ashton believed him or not, the older man simply nodded and released his arm. The next morning dawned clear and cold as the survey party set out on horseback. Yancey led them first to the northern pass, pointing out features that supported his recommendation while downplaying any drawbacks. The engineers took copious notes and measurements, their expressions revealing nothing. After a cold lunch, they continued to the southern route, the path that would destroy Zara's cabin. Yancey deliberately guided them along a section that skirted her territory, hoping to avoid a direct encounter. As they approached the ridge overlooking her hidden valley, he felt a growing unease. "The slide risk is primarily in this sector," he explained, directing their attention to a rocky escarpment. "Spring thaws could—" "Quinn," interrupted Ashton, pointing to a thin wisp of smoke rising from the trees below. "What's that?" Yancey's heart sank. "Likely trappers or prospectors," he said dismissively. "These mountains attract all sorts of transients." "That looks like a permanent structure," observed one of the younger engineers, shading his eyes. "Is there a homestead claim in this section?" Before Yancey could formulate a response, a new voice joined the conversation. "No legal claim," said Zara, emerging from the tree line with her rifle cradled in her arms. "Just occupation." The engineers startled at her sudden appearance. Yancey fought to keep his expression neutral as Zara approached, once again dressed in her mountain attire of buckskins and furs. "Gentlemen," Yancey said with forced casualness, "this is Miss Sumner. She resides in these mountains." Ashton recovered quickly, his businessman's instincts taking over. "Miss Sumner, I'm Frederick Ashton of the Western Pacific Railroad. Are you aware that this land is designated for railroad development?" "I'm aware that men with papers believe they can claim whatever they desire," she replied coolly. "I'm also aware that your surveyor has been trying to divert your attention from my home." Yancey felt 4 pairs of eyes turn to him accusingly. Zara's expression revealed nothing of their previous interactions. "You know this woman, Quinn?" Ashton demanded. "We've met," Yancey admitted. "During my initial survey." Ashton's face hardened. "And you deliberately concealed her presence when recommending the route change." "The geological concerns are real," Yancey insisted. "But yes, I also considered the human cost of displacing an established resident." "Squatter," corrected one of the other engineers, "without legal claim." "I was here before your railroad was even conceived," Zara said, her knuckles white around her rifle. "This mountain provides everything I need. I harm no one. I ask only to be left in peace." Ashton sighed with the weariness of a man who had faced similar confrontations many times. "Miss Sumner, progress cannot be stopped for one individual's preference for isolation. The railroad will benefit thousands." "It will destroy the only home I have," she countered. "The company can compensate you," Ashton offered, as Yancey had days earlier. "Enough to establish yourself properly elsewhere." Zara's bitter laugh echoed against the rocks. "And where would that be? Another piece of land that you'll decide you need in 5 years. 10. The tension mounted as they faced off, neither side willing to concede. Yancey moved his horse between them, addressing Ashton. "Sir, I believe the northern route remains the superior engineering choice, regardless of Miss Sumner's situation. But if the company insists on this southern path, then proper compensation and relocation assistance should be guaranteed." Ashton studied him with narrowed eyes. "Your professional opinion seems remarkably aligned with your personal sympathies, Quinn." "My professional opinion is based on facts, sir," Yancey replied stiffly. "The northern route avoids potential slide zones and offers more stable ground for the heavy traffic you anticipate." The standoff continued until one of the younger engineers spoke up. "Mr. Ashton, perhaps we should examine both routes more thoroughly before deciding." Quinn's geological concerns merit investigation regardless of other factors. After a tense moment, Ashton nodded. "We'll complete our assessment of both options. Miss Sumner, the company will be in contact regarding your situation once a final determination is made." He turned to Yancey. "I expect your complete cooperation and honesty moving forward, Quinn. Your future with Western Pacific depends on it." "Understood, sir." As the engineers turned their horses to continue the survey, Yancey caught Zara's eye. Her expression was unreadable, but he thought he detected a glimmer of something beyond her usual suspicion, perhaps disappointment that he hadn't fought harder, or perhaps gratitude that he'd fought at all. Either way, he knew his attempt to protect her had been compromised. Whether it had been ruined entirely remained to be seen. That evening, after the engineers retired to their rooms at the Walker Inn, Yancey slipped away. He rode by moonlight to the waterfall meeting place Zara had designated, hoping she would check for messages. He left a detailed note explaining what had transpired and what might come next, concealed in a weatherproof tin beneath a distinctive boulder. What he couldn't properly express in writing was his growing admiration for her resilience, or his increasing certainty that forcing her from her mountain would be a grave injustice. Nor could he articulate the strange pull he felt toward her, a woman so different from any he had known, whose fierce independence both challenged and captivated him. 3 more days of tense surveys followed. The engineers meticulously documented both routes, while Yancey continued to advocate for the northern option with every legitimate argument he could muster. Zara remained conspicuously absent, though Yancey often felt watched as they traversed her territory. On the 4th day, the engineering team gathered their final notes and prepared to depart for Chicago, where the route decision would be finalized. Ashton pulled Yancey aside as they packed their equipment. "The company will require your presence in Chicago when we present our findings," he said. "Be ready to travel in 1 week's time." Yancey nodded, understanding this was as much to keep him under supervision as it was to utilize his expertise. "And if the southern route is selected," Ashton's expression was measured, "then we'll handle the squatter situation according to company policy." Fairly, but firmly. After the engineers departed, Yancey felt the weight of his divided loyalties pressing down on him. His career, everything he'd worked for since leaving his father's struggling ranch in Colorado, hung in the balance. Yet he couldn't shake the image of Zara's hard-won sanctuary being demolished for railroad ties. That night, he rode again to the waterfall. To his surprise, Zara herself was waiting by the hunter's blind, her figure illuminated by a small fire. "I thought you'd come," she said as he dismounted. "Though I wasn't certain." "I owed you an explanation," he replied, tethering his horse. "Things didn't go as I'd hoped. They rarely do." She gestured for him to join her by the fire. "Your note was clear enough. They suspect your motives and doubt your judgment." "They haven't decided on the route yet," he offered, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. Zara stared into the flames. "We both know which way they'll choose. Your railroad needs the straightest, cheapest path. My existence doesn't factor into their calculations." The resignation in her voice bothered him more than anger would have. "There are still options, Zara. Legal strategies, legal." She almost smiled. "The law hasn't been kind to women without means or powerful connections." They sat in silence for a time, the crackling fire and distant waterfall the only sounds. Finally, Zara spoke again, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "You tried. That's more than most would have done." "It's not enough," Yancey said, frustration evident in his tone. "There must be some way to preserve what you've built." She studied him in the firelight. "Why does it matter so much to you?" The question hung between them, demanding an honest answer. Yancey looked up at the vast canopy of stars visible through the mountain pines. When I first became a surveyor, I believed I was helping to build the future, connecting communities, opening opportunities. Most times, that's true. He prodded the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise into the darkness. But sometimes, we destroy things of value in the name of progress. Things that can't be replaced or rebuilt. Like my cabin, she said softly, not just the cabin. His eyes met hers across the flames. The life you've created, your independence, your peace. Something in her expression shifted, the wariness giving way to something more vulnerable. Peace, she repeated. Yes, that's what I found here. After everything, I finally found peace. The admission seemed to surprise even her. Yancey resisted the urge to move closer, to bridge the careful distance she maintained. They're sending me to Chicago next week, he told her. For the final route decision. She nodded slowly. Then this is goodbye. It doesn't have to be, he said before he could reconsider. Come with me. Zara's eyes widened. To Chicago? Are you mad? Not to stay, he clarified quickly. To speak for yourself. To make them see you as a person, not an obstacle. She shook her head vehemently. I won't beg for what's already mine. Not begging, fighting, on your terms. He leaned forward earnestly. The company directors are used to dealing with problems through intermediaries. They never have to face the human consequences of their decisions. You could change that. And if they still choose their precious straight line, Yancey had been considering this question for days. Then I'll help you find somewhere truly yours, somewhere with legal protection. I have savings, connections. I don't want your charity, she interrupted. Not charity, he insisted. Partnership. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was prepared to fully address. Zara stared at him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through any pretense. You don't know me, she said finally. I know enough, he replied. I know you're stronger than anyone I've met. I know you value freedom and honesty above comfort. I know you've faced injustice and refused to be broken by it. She looked away, uncomfortable with his assessment. Pretty words again. True words. Yancey stood, moving around the fire until he was beside her. He didn't touch her, but he was close enough now to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. I'm not asking for promises, Zara. I'm offering a choice beyond surrender or solitude. For a moment, something like longing crossed her face, so brief he might have imagined it. Then her expression closed again, the careful mask of self-preservation sliding back into place. I need time, she said finally, to think. Yancey nodded, respecting her caution. I leave for Chicago in 7 days. If you decide to come, meet me at the station in Taylorsville the morning of the 20th. And if I don't, then I'll still argue your case as best I can, he promised, and I'll leave word at the waterfall about the decision. She seemed to accept this, rising to her feet. It's late. You should return to town before your absence raises questions. As Yancey mounted his horse, he looked down at Zara, silhouetted against the dying fire. Whatever you decide, he said quietly, I'm glad our paths crossed, Zara Sumner. A small, sad smile touched her lips. Even though I held you at rifle point. Especially then, he replied with a gentle laugh. It's not every day a man gets to see his own preconceptions so thoroughly challenged. With that, he turned his horse and rode back toward Taylorsville, leaving Zara to her fire and her decision. The week passed in a blur of preparations and paperwork. Yancey finalized his reports, packed his surveying equipment, and settled his accounts in Taylorsville. All the while, he wondered if Zara would appear at the station as he'd suggested. The rational part of him doubted it. She had every reason to distrust his world and its institutions. Yet something deeper hoped she would take the risk. On the morning of departure, Yancey arrived at the stagecoach station early, his luggage loaded and ticket secured. The eastbound coach would take him to Cheyenne, where he would connect with the Union Pacific Line to Chicago. As departure time approached, he scanned the small gathering of passengers and onlookers, searching for a familiar face. She didn't come. As the driver called for boarding, Yancey felt a weight settle in his chest. He had pushed too far, asked too much. Of course she wouldn't abandon her mountain sanctuary to journey into the heart of the civilization she'd fled. He was about to climb aboard when a commotion at the edge of town caught his attention. A rider was approaching at speed, kicking up dust along the main street. As the figure drew closer, Yancey's pulse quickened. Zara reined her horse to a stop near the stagecoach, drawing curious stares from the gathered travelers. She was dressed in a simple dark riding skirt and jacket, town clothes, but practical ones, with her hair braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A single leather satchel was tied behind her saddle. "You're late," Yancey said, unable to suppress his smile. "I almost didn't come at all," she replied, dismounting. Her expression was resolute but tinged with uncertainty. "I'm still not convinced this isn't madness." "The best decisions often appear that way initially," he offered, taking her satchel as the stagecoach driver called impatiently for final boarding. Zara glanced at the waiting coach, then back at Yancey. "I can't promise anything," she warned. "If this fails, then we try something else," he said simply. "Together." She drew a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "One chance," she said. "That's all I'm offering this plan of yours, one chance to make them listen." It wasn't a declaration of trust, let alone anything deeper, but from Zara Sumner, it was monumental. Yancey nodded solemnly, acknowledging the significance of her decision. "Your horse?" he asked, nodding to the tired mount, arranged with the livery. "He'll be cared for until I return." The "if I return" remained unspoken but understood. As they boarded the stagecoach together, Yancey noticed how Zara positioned herself by the window, her body tense, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. 5 years of isolation had left their mark. Crowds, noise, confinement all clearly distressed her. Yet there was determination in the set of her jaw as the coach lurched forward, beginning the journey that would take her farther from her mountains than she had been in years. "I brought this," she said quietly once they were underway. From inside her jacket she withdrew a folded document. "My husband's deed to our original homestead. The mortgage Hargrove claimed was in default." Yancey examined the weathered paper. "You kept this all this time?" "It was the only proof I had that I once owned something legally," she explained. "Not that it helped me then. The document was legitimate but incomplete, without evidence of the subsequent loans Hargrove had alleged. If those loans had ever truly existed, there would be records that might not withstand scrutiny if examined by impartial eyes. This could be useful," Yancey said thoughtfully. "Not just for the railroad matter, but perhaps for addressing the original injustice as well." Zara's laugh held little humor. "Justice is a luxury few can afford, Mr. Quinn." "Yancey," he corrected gently. "If we're to be partners in this venture, you might as well use my name." She considered this, then nodded. "Yancey," she repeated, as if testing how the name felt on her tongue. The journey to Chicago was arduous. 3 days of stagecoach travel to Cheyenne, followed by 4 more on the train eastward. For Zara, each mile took her further from everything familiar and deeper into a world she had rejected. The train especially tested her reserves, the crowded cars, the noise, the constant movement, all wearing on her hard-won serenity. Yancey did what he could to ease her discomfort, securing private compartments when possible and creating buffer space between her and curious fellow travelers. He watched her stare out windows at the changing landscape, witnessed her silent distress as settlements grew larger and wild spaces diminished, saw how she flinched at sudden noises or unexpected movements. Yet there were moments of wonder too. The first time she'd seen the vastness of the prairie from the train window, stretching endlessly under an enormous sky. Her fascination with the great bridges spanning rivers she'd only heard of in stories. The quiet amazement as she leafed through a newspaper and realized how much of the world had transformed while she lived in her mountain solitude. On the seventh day, as the train approached Chicago, Zara's anxiety became palpable. The endless succession of buildings, the smoke-filled sky, the sheer number of people visible through the window, all of it overwhelmed senses accustomed to the pristine silence of mountain wilderness. "I can't breathe here," she whispered, her knuckles white where she gripped the seat. Yancey placed his hand near hers, not quite touching. "Focus on why we came," he said quietly. "This is temporary, a means to an end." She nodded stiffly, her jaw clenched as she fought to master her panic. By the time they disembarked at the bustling Chicago station, she had composed herself, though Yancey could see the effort it cost her. "The company has arranged accommodations," he told her as they navigated through the crowded terminal. "We meet with the board tomorrow morning." "Separate rooms," she stated rather than asked. "Of course," he assured her. "Your reputation—" A sharp laugh interrupted him. "My reputation is the least of my concerns, Yancey. My sanity, however." He understood then she needed space, solitude, a place to retreat from the overwhelming press of humanity and noise that was Chicago in 1876. The hotel, when they reached it, proved to be an imposing structure of brick and stone, 5 stories tall with uniformed doormen and gaslit chandeliers in the lobby. Zara moved through it like a wild creature forced into a cage, her eyes constantly tracking exits and escape routes. The adjoining rooms Yancey had arranged were on the 3rd floor, mercifully at the end of a hallway where foot traffic would be minimal. As the bellman deposited their luggage and departed with his tip, Zara immediately moved to open the window in her room, regardless of the winter chill. "I need to feel air," she explained when she caught Yancey's concerned look. "Real air." "We'll keep it brief tomorrow," he promised. "Make our case and be on the first train west afterward if that's what you want." She nodded distractedly, her attention caught by the city spread below them, a forest of chimneys and rooftops, streets teeming with carriages and pedestrians, the distant shoreline of Lake Michigan barely visible through the industrial haze. How do people live like this? She wondered aloud. Stacked atop one another, breathing smoke, never hearing silence. "They don't know anything different," Yancey replied, moving to stand beside her at the window. "Just as most couldn't imagine living alone in the mountains as you do." "As I did," she corrected quietly. "Even if we succeed tomorrow, there's no going back to before. Once the railroad comes." The unfinished thought hung between them. She was right, of course. Even if they convinced the railroad to alter its route, the encroachment of civilization into her wilderness had begun. It was only a matter of time before the solitude she cherished would be compromised. "Get some rest," Yancey suggested gently. "Tomorrow will require all your strength." After he retired to his own room, Yancey lay awake for hours, listening to the occasional soft footsteps from Zara's side as she paced, unable to settle in the unfamiliar surroundings. He wondered if he had done right by bringing her here, exposing her to all she had fled, with only the uncertain promise of preserving her home. The Western Pacific Railroad's headquarters occupied an impressive building near Chicago's financial district. Marble columns flanked the entrance, and the company's emblem, a stylized locomotive surrounded by laurels, adorned the floor of the grand lobby. Yancey felt Zara tense beside him as they entered, her discomfort evident despite the new dress they had purchased the previous evening to replace her trail-worn attire. "Remember," he said quietly as they were led toward the boardroom, "these men understand one language above all: profit. Frame your argument in terms they comprehend." "Profit," she repeated, a bitter edge to her voice. "The god of progress." Before he could respond, they were ushered into a wood-paneled chamber where a dozen men in expensive suits sat around a massive table. Ashton was already present, standing near a large map mounted on an easel. He raised an eyebrow at Zara's presence, but said nothing as the company's president, Harrison Wheeler, called the meeting to order. "Mr. Quinn," Wheeler addressed him after introductions were complete, "I understand you have brought a concerned party regarding the Wyoming Territory route." "Yes, sir," Yancey replied. "Miss Sumner's situation represents both a practical and ethical consideration for the final route selection." Wheeler's expression suggested he was accustomed to such appeals. "While the company respects local interests, Miss Sumner, I must emphasize that the broader economic benefits of the railroad far outweigh individual inconvenience." "Inconvenience," Zara echoed, her voice steady despite the tension Yancey could see in her posture. "Is that what you call destroying someone's home and livelihood?" Wheeler's smile was practiced, but cold. "The company offers fair compensation for any legitimate property claims impacted by construction." "My claim isn't on paper," Zara acknowledged, "but it's no less real. I've lived on that mountain for 5 years, building a sustainable existence that harms no one." "A squatter's rights claim rarely holds legal standing," interjected one of the other board members, "particularly against a federally approved railroad right-of-way." Yancey stepped forward. "Gentlemen, if I may direct your attention to the survey findings. The northern route I've proposed offers comparable grade with minimal additional expense. From an engineering perspective, Mr. Ashton has already presented the engineering arguments," Wheeler interrupted. "The southern route remains optimal for both construction and operational costs." Zara's hands clenched at her sides, but her voice remained controlled as she addressed the board directly. "You speak of progress and prosperity, yet you've never seen what you so casually destroy. The mountains you cut through aren't just obstacles, they're living ecosystems, homes to creatures whose existence you never consider." "Poetic sentiments," said another board member dismissively, "but hardly relevant to a business decision." "Isn't it?" she challenged. "What of the future costs when your hasty cuts trigger landslides? When spring floods wash out tracks laid too close to seasonal creek beds? When maintenance crews must battle winter conditions in passes that locals know become impassable?" This caught their attention. Several board members glanced toward Ashton, who shifted uncomfortably. "Local knowledge is valuable," Yancey added quickly, seizing the opening. "Miss Sumner has survived 5 harsh winters in those mountains. She understands the terrain in ways our limited surveys cannot capture." Wheeler leaned forward. "Are you suggesting our engineering assessments are inadequate, Quinn?" "Not inadequate, sir. Simply incomplete. No survey, however thorough, can replace years of direct observation." Zara stepped closer to the map, pointing to specific features. "This ridge collapses every spring when the snowmelt saturates the soil. This valley floods during summer thunderstorms. These slopes accumulate dangerous ice that doesn't melt until late May." Her confident identification of potential hazards created a ripple of murmured conversation around the table. Yancey could see calculation replacing dismissal in some of the board members' eyes. Increased maintenance costs could indeed offset initial construction savings, noted an older board member. Perhaps the northern route merits reconsideration. Or perhaps, suggested Wheeler, studying Zara with new interest, we might benefit from local expertise while maintaining the preferred route. Zara frowned. Meaning, the company could hire you as a consultant during construction, Wheeler proposed. Your knowledge would help us anticipate and mitigate natural challenges, while adequate compensation would allow you to establish yourself elsewhere. It was a shrewd counter-offer, one that acknowledged her value while still achieving the company's primary objective. Yancey watched Zara carefully, seeing the conflict play across her features. The proposal offered recognition and financial security, but required surrendering her home and way of life. Before she could respond, Yancey placed Thomas Sumner's deed on the table. "There's another matter to consider, gentlemen. The circumstances under which Miss Sumner was forced from her original property in Taylorsville." Wheeler's eyebrows rose. "I fail to see the relevance." "The relevance, sir, is that Miss Sumner may have a legitimate legal claim to valuable property near Taylorsville property. Your railroad will significantly increase in value once completed." This caught their attention. Property values along railroad routes inevitably soared, creating fortunes for those who held land in the right locations. If Zara had a credible claim to land near a planned station site, it changed the equation considerably. "This alleged claim," began one of the lawyers present, "is documented here," Yancey finished, "and involves potential improprieties by the local banker, Edward Hargrove, who happens to be one of your company's smaller shareholders." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A potentially scandalous legal battle involving one of their investors, just as the company was soliciting additional capital for construction, was the last thing they wanted. Wheeler's expression hardened. "You present a complex situation, Mr. Quinn." "One with a straightforward solution," Yancey replied. "Adjust the route to preserve Miss Sumner's current home, and she waives any claim to investigate or pursue restitution regarding her former property." It was a gamble. Zara had made no such offer, and the legal validity of her claim against Hargrove remained untested. But Yancey had seen enough corporate negotiations to know that certainty was often more valuable than potential gain. Wheeler conferred quietly with several board members before addressing Zara directly. "You would formalize such an agreement, relinquishing all claims regarding the Taylorsville property in exchange for our selection of the northern route." Zara glanced at Yancey, a question in her eyes. He gave a slight nod. This was their strongest position, even if it meant abandoning possible justice against Hargrove. "Yes," she said finally. "Leave my mountain home untouched, and I'll sign whatever documents your lawyers require regarding Taylorsville." Wheeler considered this, then nodded. "We'll need to verify the details, of course. And there would be additional conditions: right of access for maintenance crews should any issues develop with the northern route, for instance." "Limited access," Zara countered. "Scheduled and by established paths only." More negotiation followed, boundaries defined, terms clarified, concessions made on both sides. By the meeting's end, a preliminary agreement had been drafted. The railroad would pursue the northern route, preserving Zara's cabin and immediate surroundings, while she would surrender any claims to her former property and grant limited access rights to railroad personnel. As they left the railroad offices, stepping into the cold Chicago afternoon, Zara seemed almost dazed by what had transpired. "Did we just win?" she asked quietly. "We did," Yancey confirmed, unable to contain his smile. "Though I may have just sacrificed my future with Western Pacific in the process." The realization struck Zara then. Your position I never considered. I did, he assured her. It was my choice. They walked in silence for several blocks, processing the implications of the morning's events. Finally, Zara spoke again. What will you do now, if they don't retain you? Yancey had been considering this question since the moment he'd decided to advocate for her. There are other surveying positions, other companies, or perhaps. He hesitated, then continued more carefully. Perhaps it's time I considered a different path altogether. Because of me, she said, the weight of it evident in her tone. Because of what I learned through you, he corrected. About what matters. About questioning whether progress always follows the straightest line. They reached the hotel, but instead of entering, Yancey suggested they continue walking. Chicago's waterfront stretched before them, the vastness of Lake Michigan offering the closest thing to wilderness the city could provide. Zara seemed to breathe easier as they left the densest part of the city behind. When do we leave? She asked, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon where water met sky. We can depart tomorrow, Yancey replied. The paperwork will follow by post once their lawyers finalize everything. She nodded, relief evident in the loosening of her shoulders. Good, I need my mountains. They walked in companionable silence until they reached a quiet section of the shore. Zara stared out at the gray waters, her expression contemplative. I never thanked you, she said finally. For believing me worth the effort, for risking your position. You're welcome, Yancey said simply. Then, choosing his words with care, he added, though I hope this isn't the end of our association. Zara turned to face him fully, studying him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see through pretense. What exactly are you proposing, Yancey Quinn? He took a deep breath, suddenly aware that facing armed bandits had been less intimidating than this moment of vulnerability. I'm proposing that I'd like to know you better, he said honestly. That perhaps, if you're willing, I might visit your mountain from time to time, that we might discover if there's more between us than a shared battle against a railroad. A small smile, the first genuine one he'd seen from her, touched her lips. You'd court a mountain witch. I'd court Zara Sumner, he corrected, who happens to be the most remarkable woman I've ever encountered. The wind off the lake tousled her hair as she considered his words. I'm not easy to know, she warned, and my trust comes harder than most. I'm aware, he said with a slight smile. The rifle pointed at my chest on our first meeting made that abundantly clear. This drew a soft laugh from her, a sound he realized he'd never heard before. It transformed her face, softening the hard edges carved by years of solitude and wariness. Visits, she said finally. Occasional visits might be acceptable. It was far from a declaration of affection, but from Zara it represented a monumental concession. Yancey's heart lightened at this small victory. Then let's go home, he said, offering his arm in a gesture that left her free to accept or decline. Your home, that is, where you can breathe again. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand lightly on his arm, not quite leaning on him, but acknowledging the connection between them. Together they turned back toward the city, their steps lighter despite the uncertain future ahead. The return journey to Wyoming seemed to pass more quickly than their eastward travel. Each mile westward visibly eased Zara's tension, as if she were slowly shedding the constraints of civilization. By the time the stagecoach delivered them to Taylorsville in late January, the brittle defensiveness that had characterized her in Chicago had given way to a quiet alertness that Yancey found far more natural. They paused in town only long enough to retrieve her horse and purchase necessary supplies. Yancey noted how the townspeople regarded Zara with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, the mountain woman who had returned from her isolation, accompanied by the railroad surveyor. Speculation hummed through the general store as they loaded their purchases. "Pay them no mind," Yancey murmured as Zara's shoulders tensed under the stairs. "Their opinions matter less than the winter wind," she replied, though he could see the effort it took her to maintain her composure in their presence. They departed as snow began to fall, climbing steadily toward the mountains that loomed protectively above the town. Zara led the way confidently, despite the deteriorating weather conditions. By nightfall, they reached her cabin, finding it untouched but cold, the fire long extinguished during her absence. Zara moved through the familiar space with visible relief, touching objects as if to reassure herself they were real. Yancey busied himself bringing in firewood and supplies, giving her the space to reacclimate to her sanctuary. When the fire finally blazed in the hearth and the cabin began to warm, Zara seemed to fully relax for the first time since they'd left for Chicago. She breathed deeply, closing her eyes for a moment as if in meditation. "Home," she said softly. Yancey smiled, warmed by her contentment even as he recognized this moment marked a transition. Their shared purpose saving her home had been accomplished. Now they would need to discover what, if anything, existed between them beyond that common cause. "I should make camp," he said, reluctant to presume upon her hospitality. "There's still enough light to reach that cave you mentioned." Zara considered this, then shook her head. "The temperature is dropping fast. The cave would be like ice." She gestured to the fire. "You can stay, tonight." It was a practical offer rather than a romantic one, but Yancey appreciated it nonetheless. They prepared a simple meal together, moving around the small cabin with growing ease in each other's presence. As they ate, Yancey shared his plans for the immediate future. "I've telegraphed an old colleague in Denver," he explained. "He's offered me survey work for the territorial government mapping watersheds, marking boundaries. It would mean traveling, but with a home base in Colorado." Zara nodded, understanding the implications. Denver was a considerable distance from her mountain, but not an insurmountable one. "When will you go?" "Not until spring," he said. "The passes are too treacherous now." What remained unspoken was that this arrangement would give them time to determine whether the connection they'd begun to forge was worth preserving across distance. Time to see if Zara could open herself to the possibility of something beyond her hard-won solitude. As winter settled fully upon the mountains, Yancey established himself in Taylorsville, taking a room at the Walker Inn while making frequent trips to Zara's cabin. These visits followed a pattern that gradually evolved as their comfort with one another grew. At first, he brought supplies and news, staying only for brief conversations before returning to town. Gradually, these visits extended to shared meals, then to helping with projects around her homestead, reinforcing the cabin roof, constructing better storage for her preserved foods, expanding the small stable for her horse. Through these shared tasks, barriers slowly lowered. Zara began to share stories of her earlier life, her childhood on a small farm north of Taylorsville, her marriage to Thomas at 18, their dreams of building something lasting together before pneumonia claimed him at 23. In turn, Yancey spoke of his own past growing up on a struggling ranch in Colorado, losing his mother young, his determination to find work that would allow him to see beyond the confines of his father's failing property. February turned to March, and as the snow began to recede, Yancey found himself spending more nights in that cave near Zara's cabin, unwilling to make the treacherous night journey back to Taylorsville, but equally unwilling to presume too much regarding her private space. Their relationship remained in a careful limbo, more than friendship, less than courtship, defined by mutual respect and growing affection neither was quite ready to name. The thaw brought developments from both the railroad company and Taylorsville. Official documents arrived confirming the northern route selection. Along with the legal releases Zara had agreed to sign regarding her former property. Meanwhile, word spread through town that Edward Hargrove had abruptly sold his banking interests and departed for California, supposedly for health reasons. Coincidence? Zara asked when Yancey brought this news. Possibly, he replied with a smile that suggested otherwise. Or perhaps someone at Western Pacific made inquiries that left him feeling exposed. The railroad matter settled, Yancey could no longer delay his departure for Denver. On their last evening together before his journey, they sat on the porch of Zara's cabin, watching the sunset paint the western mountains in brilliant orange and gold. "I could return in June," he said, breaking a comfortable silence. "The survey work allows for some flexibility." Zara nodded, her expression contemplative as she gazed at the familiar landscape. "I'd like that." Emboldened by her response, Yancey reached across the space between them, his hand covering hers where it rested on the rough-hewn bench. To his surprise and pleasure, she turned her palm upward, allowing their fingers to intertwine. "This isn't a farewell," he said softly. "No," she agreed, "though I'm still not certain what it is." Yancey smiled at her honesty. "Neither am I, but I'd like to discover it if you're willing." She met his gaze then, the wariness that had dominated their early interactions now tempered by something warmer. "I find myself surprisingly willing." They sat in silence as darkness fell, hands joined, both aware that something significant had shifted between them. When morning came, their parting was quiet but charged with unspoken promise. No dramatic declarations, no desperate embraces, just the certainty that this separation was temporary. A pause rather than an ending. True to his word, Yancey returned in June, then again in August and October. Each visit lengthened, their connection deepening with shared experiences and growing understanding. Zara began to accompany him on occasional trips to Taylorsville, gradually reclaiming her place in the community on her own terms. The woman who had once been whispered about as the Mountain Witch slowly became recognized as a resourceful healer with unparalleled knowledge of local plants and wildlife. By the time winter returned, bringing with it the first anniversary of their meeting, the nature of their relationship had transformed. On a clear December evening, with snow dusting the pines around her cabin, Yancey asked the question that had been forming in his mind for months. "Marry me," he said simply, as they stood together watching stars emerge above the mountains. "Not to change who you are or where you live, but to share this life you've built, to face whatever comes together." Zara turned to him, snowflakes catching in her dark hair. The woman who had once held him at rifle point now regarded him with eyes soft with an emotion he'd watched grow slowly, steadily over the changing seasons. "Yes," she said, her voice clear in the mountain silence, "but on one condition." "Name it," he replied immediately. A smile touched her lips. "That we keep this place. No matter where else life might take us, this mountain remains our sanctuary." "Always," he promised, drawing her into his arms. "Some places mark the soul too deeply to ever abandon." Their wedding the following spring was a simple affair, held on the plateau near Zara's cabin, with the mountains as their witnesses. A handful of people attended: the minister from Taylorsville, Yancey's colleagues from Denver, and a few townspeople who had come to respect Zara's resilience and knowledge. As the years passed, they found a rhythm to their life together. Yancey's work took him away for weeks at a time, but he always returned to the mountain cabin that remained their true home. Zara maintained her independence and self-sufficiency, yet gradually opened herself to deeper connections with the community below. Together they weathered the continuing changes that progress brought to the region: more settlements, more travelers, the completed railroad passing visible in the distance from their mountain home. In the summer of 1879, their first child was born, a son they named Thomas, after Zara's first husband. A daughter, Eleanor, followed 2 years later. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family, with Yancey adding rooms and improvements while respecting the simple, functional beauty of Zara's original design. The children grew strong in the mountain air, learning both their father's formal education and their mother's wilderness wisdom. They rode into Taylorsville for schooling as they grew older, but always returned to the freedom of their mountain home, where they learned to track game, identify healing plants, and respect the delicate balance of the natural world. By 1890, Taylorsville had grown into a proper town, with a railroad station, a small college, and growing industries. Zara and Yancey had become respected figures in the community, he as the territorial surveyor, whose maps were renowned for their accuracy. She as the herbalist and midwife, whose remedies often succeeded where conventional medicine failed. Yet they remained most at home on their mountain, where the cabin Zara had built in desperation had expanded into a comfortable homestead, surrounded by gardens, orchards, and the wild beauty she had first sought for healing. On cool evenings, they still sat together on the porch, watching sunsets over peaks they both knew intimately. Sometimes they spoke of the unlikely path that had brought them together: a desperate woman with a rifle, a surveyor with divided loyalties, and the courage to imagine a future neither had anticipated. "You ever regret it?" Yancey asked once, as they watched their teenage children racing horses in the meadow below the cabin. "Allowing me into your sanctuary," Zara's hand found his, the gesture now as natural as breathing after 15 years together. "Never," she said simply. "Though I still maintain pointing that rifle at you was one of my better decisions." Yancey laughed, the sound echoing across the valley. "How do you figure that?" Her smile, once so rare, now a familiar treasure, brightened her face. "It ensured you paid proper attention from the very beginning." As twilight deepened around them, Zara leaned against her husband's shoulder, gazing out at the wilderness that had saved her life, and unexpectedly led her to a love she had never imagined possible. The railroad tracks glinted in the distance, a reminder of the threat that had first brought them together, now simply another feature in the landscape of their shared life. "We should check the northern creek tomorrow," she said after a comfortable silence. "The Beaver Dam needs reinforcement before spring floods." "Together," Yancey agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Always together." The woman who had once lived wild in the mountains and the cowboy who had earned her trust had built something as enduring as the peaks that surrounded them: a life balanced between solitude and connection, independence and partnership, the unchanging rhythms of nature and the inevitable march of progress. And through it all, the mountain remained their constant, the sanctuary that had brought them together and continued to shelter the life they had created, against all odds, from a first meeting at Rifle Point on a snow-covered ridge in the winter of 1876.